It was the winter of 1475, and the world was silent before the storm. The rivers of Moldavia had frozen into glass. The forests stood like black teeth against a pale sky, and across the horizon came the sound of death, the march of an army so vast it blotted out the snow. 120,000 soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, their banners heavy with frost, their horses breathing clouds into the frozen dawn. They were the unstoppable force of Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who had taken Constantinople and humbled empires. But this time they were riding into something far more terrifying than an army. They were riding into a trap designed by a man the chronicles would name Stephen the Great, the Prince of Moldavia, the shepherd of a land of forests and fog, who would give the Ottoman Empire a lesson written in blood and ice. No one in Europe believed Moldavia could stand. It was a small principality caught between giants, the Ottomans to the south, the Hungarians and Poles to the west, and the shadow of Tatars to the east. But Stephen knew the land better than any king, better even than the generals who served him. He knew the mud that swallowed horses, the rivers that froze and broke without warning, the fog that could hide an entire army. He knew that if Moldavia could not fight with numbers, it would fight with nature itself. The Sultan had sent Suleiman Pasha, one of his most seasoned commanders, to crush Moldavia once and for all. He promised the campaign would be swift, that the Moldavian resistance would end before spring thawed the ground. The Ottoman army, swollen with mercenaries and banners from every corner of the empire, advanced with drums, their confidence as great as their number. Behind them came engineers, cannons and slaves dragging supplies through snow. To them Moldavia was nothing but another province to be conquered, another victory to be sung in the mosques of Constantinople. But Stephen the Great was not preparing for a defence. He was preparing for a massacre. He called his boyars, his warriors, his peasants and his priests. He spoke to them not as a ruler, but as one of them, a man defending his home, his faith, and his dead. He told them that if Moldavia fell, there would be no mercy, no tomorrow, no graves for their children. He ordered the villages burned, the food hidden, the rivers fouled. He turned his land into a ghost before the invaders even arrived. And when the Ottoman army crossed into Moldavian lands, they found not resistance, but silence. The fields were empty, the wells poisoned, the smoke of abandoned homes rising into the sky like ghosts warning them to turn back. Their scouts vanished, their horses grew thin. Every night that they could hear drums from the forests, far away at first, then closer, then gone again, as if the trees themselves had begun to whisper. Stephen watched them from the hills, moving his small force of 40,000 men like shadows through the woods. His army was a mixture of soldiers and villagers, men hardened by cold and hunger, armed with axes and faith. He had allies, a few from Poland, some from Hungary, but most were his own people, defending the soil their fathers had bled for. For days he let the Ottomans advance deeper into the valley near Vaslui, where the fog hung so thick that a man could not see his own spear. The ground was soft and treacherous, the rivers swollen with melting ice, and it was there, in the heart of that white silence, that Stephen built his trap. He ordered trenches dug and bridges sabotaged. He placed his archers on the ridges, hidden among trees dusted with frost. He positioned his cavalry in the mists, ready to strike from every direction. He even used oxen draped with flaming straw to mimic retreating soldiers, luring the enemy into the killing ground. On the morning of January 10th, 1475, the valley of Vaslui disappeared beneath a shroud of fog. The Ottomans could not see more than a few feet ahead, but from somewhere in the mist, the sound of horns echoed, long, deep, and sorrowful. Then came the drums, hundreds of them. The noise rolled across the valley like thunder, multiplied by echoes until it seemed that all of Europe was marching towards them. The Ottomans halted, confused, then the arrows began to fall. From the unseen ridges came volleys of death, invisible killers striking from the clouds. Horses screamed, soldiers stumbled, banners fell. The fog turned black with smoke as Moldavian cannons opened fire from hidden emplacements. their shots muffled by the valley walls. The Ottomans tried to form lines, but the mud clung to their boots and swallowed their wheels. Panic rippled through their ranks like fire. And then from the fog, Stephen's army appeared, not as men but as phantoms. They came screaming with axes, sabres and pikes, their armour glinting faintly in the white haze. They struck the Ottoman flanks first, slicing through the disoriented troops before melting back into the mist. Every time the Ottomans tried to advance, they were hit from another side. It was not a battle, it was a nightmare. The Moldavians fought as if possessed, guided by priests carrying crosses and banners of saints. Every cry of Doa mi ajuta, God help us, echoed like a war hymn across the valley. The Ottomans tried to push forward, their numbers still immense, but every path led into chaos. Bridges collapsed beneath their weight, traps exploded from the ground, and the fog swallowed their formations whole. By midday, the valley was a cauldron of terror, the smell of gunpowder mixed with the stench of blood and snow. Commanders shouted orders no one could hear. Horses crashed into each other, their riders lost in confusion. The Moldavians struck again and again from every side, vanishing before counterattacks could form. And above it all, Stephen the Great watched from the hills, his face calm, his eyes cold as the winter around him. When he finally gave the order for his heavy cavalry to charge, the Ottomans were already broken in spirit. The Moldavian knights descended like a storm, their lances gleaming, their war cries shaking the valley. The Ottoman line shattered. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled into the marshes, only to drown in the frozen rivers. The once mighty army of the Sultan, the same empire that had conquered Byzantium, was crushed beneath the fury of 40,000 Moldavians. The fog that had hidden Stephen's army now became the grave shroud of the Ottomans. As the sun struggled to rise above the smoke-filled valley, it revealed a scene of devastation so complete that even Stephen's men stood in silence. The snow was blackened with ash and crimson with blood. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay where they had fallen, their banners trampled into the frozen mud, their armour shattered. The air hung thick with the cries of the wounded, the hiss of dying fires, and the faint sound of prayers whispered over the dead. It was said that of the 120,000 soldiers who entered Moldavia, less than half ever saw their homeland again. Some fled south into the forests, only to be cut down by Moldavian ambushes. Others drowned in the icy rivers, their corpses drifting under sheets of ice until spring thawed the current. The victory was so complete, so unthinkable, that the chronicles of the time struggled to describe it without trembling. The Sultan's armies, the same that had once taken Constantinople and crushed kingdoms, had been broken by a nation so small that most of Europe had barely heard its name. When the battle ended, Stephen walked through the valley in silence. He did not celebrate, he did not smile. He ordered his soldiers to bury the dead, friend and foe alike, for the stench of victory is the same as the stench of defeat. He prayed over the field, his sword planted in the earth, his voice quiet against the wind. To his men he was not just their ruler, he was their protector, their symbol of endurance, a prince who had faced the storm and outlasted it. News of the victory spread like wildfire across Christendom. From Poland to Venice, from Rome to Hungary, word reached kings and popes that the seemingly invincible Ottomans had been stopped, not by an empire, but by a man and his people standing on frozen soil. Pope Sixtus IV called Stephen Athleta Christi, the champion of Christ. The kings of Europe sent him letters of admiration and promises of aid, though few would truly come to his side when the next war began. Even within the Ottoman court, the shock was profound. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had brought Rome's Eastern Empire to its knees, was said to have gone silent when he heard of Vaslui. His generals urged revenge, but he hesitated, for the defeat was not merely military, it was psychological. An empire that had conquered continents had been humiliated by a land of forests and peasants. Stephen knew the victory was not the end. The Ottomans would return, they always did, so he turned his triumph into preparation. He rebuilt his fortresses, trained new soldiers, and repaired the burned villages. He sent envoys across Europe, begging for support, warning that if Moldavia fell, the Ottomans would march deeper into Christendom. Few listened. To most rulers, Vaslui was a miracle, not a warning. But to Stephen, it was the beginning of a greater struggle. He ruled as both warrior and monk, spending his days fortifying his borders and his nights in prayer. The churches he built after each victory still stand, carved with scenes of angels and saints, their walls painted with the story of a nation that refused to die. The people of Moldavia called him Cel Mare, the Great, not for his wealth or titles, but for his endurance, for his willingness to stand when no one else would. The Battle of Vaslui became legend. The fog, the drums, the desperate courage of men defending their homeland, all were remembered as divine providence. Chroniclers wrote that God himself had blinded the Ottoman soldiers, that angels had marched beside Stephen's men. And perhaps, in a sense, they were right, for no human strategy alone could explain such a triumph. Yet Stephen never forgot the cost. Tens of thousands of his own men had fallen. Villages were burned, families destroyed. He wore his victories like wounds, reminders that every triumph in war is paid for in blood. When envoys came to praise him, he received them in plain robes, his crown set aside. He told them that Moldavia did not win because it was powerful, but because it refused to kneel. In the years that followed, the Ottomans returned again and again. Stephen fought them 24 times and lost only 2 battles, each time retreating, only to rise stronger. He became a symbol not only for Moldavia, but for every nation standing in the shadow of empire. His defiance kept the Ottomans from advancing further into Eastern Europe for decades, buying time for kingdoms that would otherwise have fallen. But his story, like all legends, was written not in marble but in memory. When he died in 1504, he was buried in the Putna Monastery, the house of prayer he had built with his own hands. There, among the forests that had hidden his armies and the rivers that had swallowed his enemies, his body was laid to rest. Yet his spirit never left. Even now, the people of Romania, of Moldavia, of the lands once guarded by his sword, remember him as Stefan cel Mare, Stephen the Great, the prince who stood against an empire and made the impossible real. The Ottoman Empire would rise again and again in power, conquering cities, ruling millions. But Vaslui remained the wound that never healed, a reminder that numbers and pride are no match for will and faith. To this day, historians call it one of the greatest tactical victories in medieval history, a masterpiece of deception, terrain, and courage. And though the world may have forgotten the sound of those Moldavian drums, their echo still lingers in the valleys of Vaslui, carried by the winter winds that once hid an army and a miracle. If this story moved you, if you believe history is not just a tale of kings and empires, but of courage, faith, and the defiance of the human spirit, then subscribe to the channel and like this video, because the past still speaks to those willing to listen, and the victory of Vaslui still reminds us that even the smallest nation can change the course of the world.